In candlelit chambers draped in velvet, nobles sipped their nightly tonic, believing it would soothe the nerves and bring restful sleep. But for some, it was their final drink. Tonight, we enter the world of Renaissance Italy, where potions were laced with herbs, superstition, and sometimes poison. Behind every golden goblet was a whisper of betrayal, and bedtime became a dangerous ritual dressed in elegance. Sleep came easily, sometimes forever. If softly told secrets and the silent dangers of history help lull your thoughts, you've found the perfect corner of the past. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to uncover more elegant shadows, forgotten fears, and whispered plots, one sleepy story at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. In the humid summer of 1503, as papal servants moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican Palace, they carried with them secrets that would have made the very stones of St. Peter's Basilica tremble. Hidden within the private chambers of Pope Alexander VI, nestled between the finest wines imported from the hills of Tuscany and Umbria, sat small ceramic vessels containing what appeared to be nothing more innocuous than refined sugar. The whitish, crystalline powder within these containers possessed a pleasant, almost sweet taste that would have fooled even the most discerning palate. Yet this seemingly harmless substance was cantarella, the most feared poison in all of Renaissance Italy, and the weapon of choice for the Borgia family's systematic elimination of their enemies. The very word cantarella derived from the Italian word for a venomous beetle, and by the late 15th century it had become synonymous with death served at the dinner table. According to research published in Sage journals, the Italian physician and historian Paolo Giovio described cantarella as a kind of whitish powder with a pleasant taste which resembled sugar, and that its efficacy was proved in several murders. This deceptively simple description belied the sophisticated chemistry behind what was perhaps the most refined murder weapon ever devised. The preparation of cantarella was an art form unto itself, requiring the expertise of physicians, alchemists, and pharmacists who understood the delicate balance between toxicity and detectability. As documented in academic research, it seems that cantarella was a complex mixture containing arsenic combined with alkaloids of putrefaction emitted by organic substances in the later stages of decay. The process began with high-quality white arsenic, arsenious acid, which formed the deadly foundation of the mixture. This was then combined with what the Borgias called alkaloids of putrefaction, substances extracted from decomposing organic matter through a process that would have challenged even the most skilled medieval chemists. The creation of these alkaloids required patience and a strong stomach. According to historical accounts detailed in medical research, the Borgias' white cantarella powders generally believed to have consisted mainly of arsenic. They did apparently add arsenic to the decomposing flesh of toads and other animals and then tapped the fluid oozing from the carcasses. This grotesque process involved placing arsenic-treated carcasses of toads, small mammals, and other creatures in sealed containers, allowing them to decompose over weeks or months while periodically collecting the toxic fluids that seeped from the rotting flesh. The final product represented a masterpiece of medieval toxicology. Unlike crude poisons that acted quickly and obviously, cantarella could be calibrated with stunning precision. Historical records indicate that, according to the desire of the murder, cantarella could kill in a day, a month, or a year. This temporal flexibility made it the perfect weapon for political assassination, allowing the poisoner to create an alibi by ensuring that death occurred long after the toxic meal had been consumed and forgotten. The storage and handling of Cantarella within the papal apartments reflected the Borgias' methodical approach to murder. Research documents reveal that it is said that the Borgias selected and laid down rare poisons in their cellars, like precious wines. These cellars, located beneath the Apostolic Palace, contained not only the finest vintages from across Italy, but also an arsenal of toxic substances carefully catalogued and aged like rare spirits. Each container was labeled with cryptic symbols that only the Borgia inner circle could decipher, indicating not only the type of poison, but also its potency and recommended dosage. The preferred method of administration was elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. Historical accounts specify that Cantarella was served in a goblet of wine at dinner. It had the reputation to function with time clock precision. The poison's sugar-like appearance and neutral taste made it virtually impossible to detect when mixed with wine, particularly the heavy, sweet wines favored at papal banquets. The arsenic provided the killing power, while the organic alkaloids masked any metallic aftertaste that might alert a victim to their predicament. The symptoms of Cantarella poisoning were both horrific and diagnostically confusing. Medical research indicates that victims presented with a variety of symptoms including confusion, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea, which could mimic several diseases. This symptomological ambiguity was deliberate. In an age when sudden death from various illnesses was common, Cantarella poisoning could easily be attributed to natural causes. Victims typically experienced initial nausea and discomfort, followed by a period of apparent recovery before the poison's full effects manifested in violent retching, delirium, and eventual organ failure. The Borgias' systematic use of Cantarella represented more than mere murder. It was a form of chemical warfare, conducted within the sacred halls of the Vatican. Historical documentation shows that the Borgias specialized in disposing of cardinals, bishops, and nobles by using several kinds of poisons including arsenic, strychnine, cantharidin, and aconite incorporated in drinks, clothes, gloves, book pages, flowers, and drugs. While Cantarella remained their preferred poison for wine-based assassinations, it was just one weapon in an extensive arsenal of toxic substances. The political implications of this poisoning campaign were staggering. Every dinner invitation from the papal court became a potential death sentence. Every goblet of wine a game of Russian roulette. The fear generated by Cantarella extended far beyond its actual victims, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that permeated Italian noble society. Guests at papal banquets began employing food tasters, bringing their own wine, and even refusing to dine at the Vatican altogether. Yet for all their careful planning and chemical sophistication, the Borgias themselves were not immune to the very poison they had perfected. Historical records suggest that it seems that Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare accidentally fall victims to Cantarella poisoning. This twist of fate would prove that even the masters of poison were vulnerable to their own deadly creations. As the summer of 1503 drew to a close, the papal court buzzed with whispered rumors about the white powder that could sweeten wine while delivering death. But how exactly did this chemical weapon come to dominate the political landscape of Renaissance Italy, and what drove a papal family to turn the sacred act of sharing wine into an instrument of terror? The autumn of 1500 brought with it an unusually wet season to Rome, as if the very heavens wept for the crimes being committed within the eternal city's sacred precincts. Cardinal Orsini of Santa Fiora, a man whose noble lineage traced back to the ancient Roman aristocracy, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His family's traditional rivalry with the Borgias had intensified since Rodrigo Borgia's elevation to the papacy as Alexander VI, and whispers in the corridors of the Vatican suggested that the cardinal's days were numbered. Yet, when the papal Invitation arrived, embossed with the crossed keys of St. Peter and bearing the Pope's personal seal. Cardinal Orsini could not refuse without committing an act of open defiance that would seal his fate immediately. The dinner was to be held in the Pope's private dining chamber, a relatively intimate space within the Apostolic Palace decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from the life of Christ, an ironic backdrop for what would unfold. According to historical documentation, Cardinal Orsini of Santa Fiora, c. 1502, arrested by Alexander VI, suspected cantharide poisoning but died of natural causes. However, this official version of events fails to capture the elaborate theatre of death that characterized Borgia dinner parties. The preparations for such occasions revealed the meticulous attention to detail that made Borgia poisonings so devastatingly effective. Papal servants, many of whom had served the Vatican for decades, moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, yet they could not help but notice the subtle changes that preceded these special dinners. The wine selection process, normally a straightforward affair of choosing appropriate vintages to complement the evening's menu, became an exercise in deadly precision. Research into Borgia methods reveals that the Borgias specialized in disposing of cardinals, bishops, and nobles by using several kinds of poisons including arsenic, strychnine, cantharidin, and aconite incorporated in drinks. The choice of which poison to employ depended on various factors: the desired timeline for death, the need for plausible deniability, and the victim's known preferences in food and drink. For Cardinal Orsini, Cantarella represented the perfect choice. Its sugar-like appearance would dissolve seamlessly into the sweet, malmsey wine that the cardinal was known to favor. The dinner service itself followed elaborate protocols that had been refined over years of similar occasions. The papal dining chamber accommodated 12 guests, a number chosen not for its symbolic significance, but for its practical utility, large enough to provide witnesses who could attest to the convivial nature of the evening, yet small enough to maintain control over every aspect of the meal. Each place setting included multiple goblets of different sizes and shapes, ostensibly to accommodate various types of wine served throughout the evening, but actually to provide multiple opportunities for poison administration. Cardinal Orsini arrived precisely at the appointed hour, accompanied by his personal secretary and a young priest who served as his chaplain. This small entourage was standard for such occasions, as high-ranking clergy rarely travelled alone, particularly during the dangerous political climate of early 16th century Rome. The cardinal's secretary, Brother Marcello, carried with him a small leather satchel containing the cardinal's personal dining implements, a silver knife, spoon, and goblet that the cardinal preferred to use rather than the vessels provided by his hosts. This precaution, while prudent, proved ultimately insufficient against the sophisticated methods employed by the Borgias. Pope Alexander VI, despite his 69 years, maintained an impressive physical presence that commanded attention in any gathering. His penetrating dark eyes missed nothing, and his conversation flowed effortlessly between Latin, Italian, and Spanish as the situation required. On this particular evening, he appeared especially animated, regaling his guests with tales of his diplomatic victories and plans for expanding papal territories. The Pope's son, Cesare Borgia, attended as well, though he remained largely silent throughout the meal, his calculating gaze moving constantly between the guests, as if cataloguing their every reaction. The first course consisted of delicate antipasti, thin slices of prosciutto, fresh figs, and aged cheeses that paired perfectly with a light white wine from the Frascati region. This opening service provided the perfect opportunity to observe each guest's drinking habits and preferences. Cardinal Orsini, true to his reputation, showed particular appreciation for the sweeter wines, often finishing his goblet before others had completed half of theirs. This behavioral pattern had been carefully noted during previous social encounters and would prove crucial to the evening's deadly choreography. As the meal progressed through its various courses, a rich soup of capon and herbs, followed by roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, the wine service became increasingly elaborate. Each course was paired with specific vintages, and the goblets were refreshed frequently to ensure optimal flavor profiles. It was during the service of the fourth course, a dish of fresh river fish prepared with almonds and wine sauce, that the fatal goblet made its appearance. The Malmsey wine chosen for this course was a particularly fine vintage from Crete, its deep amber color and honeyed sweetness making it a perfect vehicle for concealing Cantarella's subtle presence. Historical accounts indicate that Cantarella was a kind of whitish powder with a pleasant taste which resembled sugar, making it virtually undetectable when dissolved in sweet wine. The papal wine steward, a man whose loyalty to the Borgia family had been purchased through a combination of generous payment and explicit threats, performed his duties with the same professional competence he had demonstrated for over a decade of service. Cardinal Orsini received his goblet with the customary blessing. "May this wine bring joy to your heart and strength to your spirit," and raised it in toast to his host's health. The irony of this gesture was not lost on Pope Alexander, whose slight smile suggested private amusement at the evening's proceedings. The cardinal drank deeply, savoring the wine's complex flavors while praising its quality and expressing gratitude for his host's generosity. The conversation continued for another hour as the meal concluded with a selection of honey cakes and dried fruits. Cardinal Orsini appeared in excellent spirits, laughing at the Pope's jokes and engaging in spirited theological debate with his fellow diners. He consumed 2 additional goblets of the same Malmsey wine, ensuring that his body received a thoroughly lethal dose of Cantarella. As documented in historical research, according to the desire of the murder, Cantarella could kill in a day, a month, or a year, and the dosage administered to Cardinal Orsini had been calculated to produce death within approximately 1 week. As the evening drew to a close, the guests exchanged pleasantries and made plans for future meetings that Cardinal Orsini would never attend. The papal blessing bestowed upon each departing guest carried particular weight when delivered to the cardinal. Pope Alexander's hand lingered on the man's forehead as he intoned the traditional Latin words, knowing that he was blessing a man already condemned to death by his own machinations. The days following the dinner unfolded with tragic predictability. Cardinal Orsini returned to his residence in apparent good health, continuing his normal routine of prayers, administrative duties, and social obligations. According to medical research on Cantarella's effects, victims presented with a variety of symptoms including confusion, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea which could mimic several diseases. The cardinal's illness began on the 3rd day with mild digestive discomfort that he attributed to having overindulged at the papal dinner. By the 5th day, Cardinal Orsini's condition had deteriorated significantly. His personal physician, Dr. Giovanni Alberti, diagnosed him with a fever of unknown origin complicated by severe gastric distress. The symptoms, alternating between violent vomiting and debilitating diarrhea, accompanied by increasing confusion and disorientation, suggested several possible illnesses common in Rome during the autumn months. Dr. Alberti prescribed the standard treatments of the era: bloodletting to balance the humors, herbal preparations to settle the stomach, and prayer for divine intervention. The cardinal's decline accelerated over the following days. Historical documentation reveals that he died without a will, suggesting that his final illness progressed too rapidly for him to attend to his earthly affairs. His vast estates and accumulated wealth, valued at several thousand ducats, reverted to papal control according to canonical law, a convenient outcome that provided Pope Alexander VI with both revenge against a political enemy and significant financial gain. Yet even as Cardinal Orsini lay dying in his palazzo, questions began to circulate among Rome's ecclesiastical community. The timing of his illness, coming so soon after dining with the Pope, struck many observers as suspiciously convenient. Other cardinals who had attended similar papal dinners began to experience their own mysterious ailments, though not all proved fatal. This pattern suggested a systematic campaign rather than isolated incidents of natural illness. But what drove Pope Alexander VI to transform the sacred act of breaking bread into an instrument of systematic murder, and how did the College of Cardinals respond to the growing realization that their spiritual leader had become their most dangerous enemy? The winter of 1503 arrived early in Rome, bringing with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate even the thick walls of the apostolic palace. Pope Alexander VI, now in his 72nd year, moved through his daily routines with the measured pace of a man who understood that his time on earth and on the papal throne was drawing to a close. Yet his appetite for eliminating enemies had not diminished with age. If anything, the approaching end of his pontificate had intensified his determination to secure the Borgia family's legacy through whatever means necessary, even if those means included the systematic poisoning of his own College of Cardinals. The irony of Pope Alexander VI's situation was not lost on those who observed the papal court from within its innermost circles. As documented in historical research, it has been said that in Renaissance Italy, poisoning was recognized by churchmen as a means of preferment, by statesmen as a useful political instrument, and even by governments as an engine of diplomacy. The Pope had elevated this deadly art to its highest form, transforming the Vatican itself into a laboratory for political assassination conducted through carefully orchestrated dinner parties. The success of the Borgia poisoning campaign rested on more than just the chemical sophistication of Cantarella. It required an elaborate network of accomplices, informants, and enablers who ensured that each assassination proceeded smoothly, from initial planning to final cover-up. Papal servants who had once taken pride in serving the Vicar of Christ found themselves complicit in acts that would have been unthinkable under previous pontificates. Kitchen staff learned to recognize certain wine bottles by subtle markings that indicated their deadly contents. Chaplains who had devoted their lives to administering the sacraments discovered that their presence at papal dinners served primarily to provide spiritual comfort to men who were unknowingly consuming their final meals. The psychological toll of participating in this systematic murder campaign affected everyone within the papal household, from the highest-ranking officials to the lowliest scullery workers. Many struggled to reconcile their Christian faith with their daily complicity in acts of such profound evil. Some sought comfort in the belief that they were serving a higher purpose, that eliminating the Pope's enemies somehow advanced the cause of the Church itself. Others simply accepted their situation as an unavoidable consequence of papal service, focusing on their own survival rather than the moral implications of their actions. Cardinal Michiel represented perhaps the most tragic victim of this campaign, not only because of his death, but because of the circumstances that led to his poisoning. Historical records indicate that, in 1503, the cardinal's secretary admitted under torture that he had poisoned his master on orders of the Borgias. Cardinal Michiel died in 1503. This confession revealed the extent to which the Borgia network had penetrated even the most intimate household relationships within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The recruitment and manipulation of Cardinal Michiel's secretary represented a masterpiece of psychological coercion that demonstrated the Borgias' sophisticated understanding of human nature. Rather than relying solely on bribery or threats, They exploited the complex dynamics of master-servant relationships within noble households. The secretary, Brother Antonio, had served Cardinal Michiel faithfully for over 15 years, managing his correspondence, organizing his daily schedule, and attending to countless personal needs that created an intimate bond between the two men. This very intimacy made Brother Antonio the perfect instrument for murder, as his presence in the cardinal's private chambers would never arouse suspicion. The process of turning Brother Antonio into an assassin began months before Cardinal Michiel's death. Borgia agents approached him initially with seemingly innocent requests for information about his master's activities, habits, and associations. These conversations were presented as routine intelligence gathering rather than preparation for murder, allowing Brother Antonio to participate without immediately recognizing his role in a larger conspiracy. Gradually, the requests became more specific and the payments more substantial, creating a web of financial dependence and emotional manipulation that made withdrawal increasingly difficult. The actual administration of poison to Cardinal Michiel followed a pattern that had been refined through years of similar operations. Brother Antonio received his instructions through a complex chain of intermediaries that insulated the Borgia family from direct connection to the crime. The cantarella was provided in a small glass vial disguised as a medicinal preparation, complete with Latin labels and official-looking seals that suggested ecclesiastical approval. Brother Antonio was told that the substance was a sleeping draught. To help his master rest more peacefully, a plausible cover story given Cardinal Michiel's known struggles with insomnia. The cardinal's final evening began like countless others before it. He returned to his residence after attending Vespers at Santa Maria Maggiore, sharing a light supper with Brother Antonio while discussing the next day's appointments and correspondence. The evening wine, a bottle of Chianti that Cardinal Michiel had been saving for a special occasion, provided the perfect vehicle for delivering the fatal dose of cantarella. Brother Antonio's hands trembled slightly as he poured the wine, but his master attributed this nervousness to fatigue rather than murderous intent. Cardinal Michiel consumed his poisoned wine while reviewing documents related to a property dispute involving church lands near Bologna. The conversation between master and servant continued normally for another hour, touching on routine administrative matters and plans for the upcoming Easter celebrations. When the cardinal finally retired to his chambers, he thanked Brother Antonio for his faithful service and expressed appreciation for the calming effect of the evening's wine. These words would haunt Brother Antonio for the remainder of his brief life. The cardinal's death unfolded with the predictable horror that characterized cantarella poisoning. Research indicates that victims experienced confusion, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea, which could mimic several diseases. Cardinal Michiel's suffering lasted 6 days, during which Brother Antonio maintained his charade of devoted service, even summoning physicians and priests to attend his dying master. The psychological stress of watching Cardinal Michiel's agonizing decline while knowing himself to be the cause proved almost unbearable for the secretary, who began drinking heavily to numb his conscience. When papal investigators arrived to examine the circumstances of Cardinal Michiel's death, they followed established procedures designed more to create the appearance of thoroughness than to uncover actual truth. The investigation's outcome was predetermined. Cardinal Michiel had died of natural causes, possibly typhus or another fever common during the winter months. However, the investigators' true purpose was to ensure that no evidence remained that could implicate the Borgia family in the cardinal's death. Brother Antonio's eventual capture and confession resulted not from investigative competence, but from his own psychological collapse. Historical records show that he admitted under torture that he had poisoned his master on orders of the Borgias, but this confession came only after weeks of increasingly erratic behavior that drew unwanted attention to his activities. His execution, carried out quietly in the pre-dawn hours to avoid public attention, served as both punishment for his crime and insurance against further revelations about Borgia methods. The broader implications of Cardinal Michiel's murder extended far beyond the elimination of a single political opponent. His death represented the culmination of a systematic campaign that had transformed the College of Cardinals from an advisory body of respected church leaders into a collection of terrified men who understood that their spiritual authority offered no protection against temporal power wielded through poison. Historical documentation reveals that Pope Alexander VI allegedly poisoned cardinals to inherit their estates, suggesting that financial motivation combined with political calculation to drive these murders. Yet even as Pope Alexander VI seemed to have perfected the art of assassination through poisoned wine, fate was preparing its own ironic justice. Research indicates that it seems that Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare accidentally fall victims to Cantarella poisoning. The very weapon that had served them so effectively in eliminating enemies would ultimately claim the lives of its masters, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated murder schemes could turn deadly for their perpetrators. The summer of 1503 would bring not only the deaths of Alexander VI and nearly fatal illness of Cesare Borgia, but also the end of an era in which poison had become the preferred diplomatic tool of papal policy. The white powder that had sweetened so many cups of wine while delivering death would finally claim its most prominent practitioners, leaving behind a legacy of terror that would forever change how nobles approached the simple act of sharing a drink with their host. The oppressive heat of October 1587 hung over the Villa di Poggio a Caiano like a funeral shroud, its unseasonable intensity creating an atmosphere of unease that seemed to penetrate even the villa's thick Renaissance walls. Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, had chosen this particular retreat for its relative isolation from the political turmoil of Florence, seeking a peaceful respite with his beloved second wife, Bianca Capello. Yet peace would prove elusive, for within the villa's elegant chambers, a drama of family betrayal and chemical murder was about to unfold that would claim both their lives within a matter of days. The villa itself represented the pinnacle of Medici architectural achievement, its imposing facade decorated with frescoes celebrating the family's rise to power and divine favor. Lorenzo the Magnificent had commissioned its construction in the 1480s as a symbol of Medici prestige, and successive generations had added increasingly elaborate decorations and amenities. The dining hall, where Francesco and Bianca would consume their final meals, featured a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from classical mythology, including a particularly striking depiction of Bacchus offering wine to mortals, an image that would take on sinister significance in light of subsequent events. Francesco I had assumed the title of Grand Duke in 1574 following the death of his father Cosimo I, and his 14-year reign had been marked by both cultural achievement and political controversy. His patronage of the arts rivaled that of his illustrious ancestors, attracting scholars, artists, and scientists from across Europe to the Florentine court. However, his personal life had generated considerable scandal, particularly his relationship with Bianca Capello, which had begun as an adulterous affair, while both were married to others and had culminated in their marriage following the convenient death of Francesco's first wife, Joanna of Austria, in 1578. The political implications of Francesco's marriage to Bianca extended far beyond personal scandal into the realm of dynastic succession. As documented in medical research, Ferdinando had a very good motive to kill his brother and the woman that Francesco had loved. He was at risk of being excluded from the succession if Francesco's illegitimate son Don Antonio was to inherit the title of Grand Duke, or, even worse, if Bianca was to falsify the birth of an heir. Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, Francesco's younger brother, viewed Bianca as a direct threat to his own ambitions for power and had spent years positioning himself to assume control of the Grand Duchy should circumstances permit. The relationship between the two brothers had deteriorated steadily since Francesco's marriage to Bianca. Cardinal Ferdinando, despite his ecclesiastical position, harbored worldly ambitions that were incompatible with his brother's continued reign and marriage to a woman of questionable legitimacy. Bianca's Venetian origins and previous marriage to a Florentine merchant made her an unsuitable consort in the eyes of traditional Tuscan nobility, while her apparent inability to produce a legitimate male heir for Francesco created ongoing uncertainties about the dynasty's future. The October 1587 visit to Poggio a Caiano was ostensibly a family reconciliation, prompted by Cardinal Ferdinando's unexpected decision to pay his respects to his brother and sister-in-law. Historical records indicate that, a couple of weeks after Ferdinando came, the couple suddenly fell ill. This timing would later prove crucial to understanding the mechanism and motivation for what forensic science would eventually confirm as a carefully planned double murder. The Cardinal's arrival at the villa was accompanied by considerable fanfare, befitting his status as both a prince of the church and a member of the ruling family. His entourage included personal servants, guards, and several minor ecclesiastical officials whose presence was required by protocol. More significantly, Cardinal Ferdinando brought with him his own wine steward, a man named Giuliano Boncore, who had served the Cardinal's household for over a decade and whose loyalty had been ensured through a combination of generous compensation and intimate knowledge of family secrets. The evening that would prove fatal began with all the ceremonial grandeur expected of a reunion between members of the Grand Ducal family. The villa's dining hall was illuminated by dozens of beeswax candles whose flickering light cast dancing shadows across the mythological frescoes adorning the walls. A small ensemble of musicians provided gentle accompaniment to the conversation, playing selections from the latest madrigals, while the diners savored courses prepared by Francesco's personal chef, Master Giovanni Alberti, whose culinary skills were renowned throughout Tuscany. The wine service for the evening reflected the sophisticated tastes of the Medici court. The meal began with a light white wine from the Chianti region, its crisp acidity perfectly complementing the antipasti of fresh figs, prosciutto, and aged pecorino cheese. As the courses progressed through a delicate soup of capon and herbs, roasted duck with fennel, and fresh river trout prepared with almonds and wine sauce, the wines became increasingly complex and valuable. Each goblet was presented with appropriate ceremony, the wine steward offering a brief description of the vintage's provenance and characteristics. It was during the service of the final course, a selection of honeyed cakes and preserved fruits, that the evening's most significant wine made its appearance. Cardinal Ferdinando had brought as a gift for his brother a particularly rare vintage, a sweet wine from the Greek island of Samos that had been aged for over 20 years in sealed amphora. The wine's presentation was accompanied by an elaborate speech about brotherly affection and family unity, words that would later take on deeply ironic significance given their true purpose as cover for premeditated murder. Forensic analysis, conducted centuries later, would reveal that this final wine contained lethal concentrations of arsenic, administered in a form that would have been virtually undetectable to the victims. The sweet, honeyed flavor of the Samos wine provided perfect camouflage for the arsenic's subtle, metallic taste, while its prestigious reputation ensured that Francesco and Bianca would consume it with appreciation rather than suspicion. Francesco, I raised his goblet in toast to his brother's health and generosity, praising both the wine's quality and the thoughtfulness of the gift. Bianca, following court protocol, waited for her husband to drink before lifting her own goblet to her lips. Both consumed substantial portions of the poisoned wine, ensuring that their bodies received doses well beyond the threshold for survival. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on family business, plans for future celebrations, and Cardinal Ferdinando's ecclesiastical responsibilities. The symptoms of acute arsenic poisoning began to manifest within hours of the fatal meal. Medical documentation indicates that most of the symptoms reported by the doctors attending Francesco during his last days are typical of arsenic poisoning: nausea and violent vomiting as initial symptoms, cold sweats, repeated requests for cold drinks because of terrible dryness and constant gastric burning. Both Francesco and Bianca experienced these initial symptoms almost simultaneously, a fact that should have aroused suspicion, but was attributed to contaminated food, affecting both diners equally. The progression of their illness followed the classic pattern of acute arsenic poisoning, with periods of apparent improvement alternating with devastating relapses. Research documents show that Francesco endured the persistence of violent and convulsive vomiting, aggressive and delirious restlessness, apparent improvement 4 to 5 days after the onset of illness, followed by the sudden return of symptoms. This roller coaster pattern of recovery and decline created false hope among family members and physicians, while ensuring that the victims suffered prolonged agony before their inevitable deaths. Bianca's condition paralleled her husband's suffering, though historical records note that much less is known about Bianca's illness, though her doctors reported that she had been struck by a disease very similar in nature to that of her beloved husband. The similarity of their symptoms, combined with the timing of their onset, provided clear evidence of intentional poisoning, yet contemporary physicians lacked the forensic knowledge necessary to identify arsenic as the cause of their patients' distress. Cardinal Ferdinando maintained an elaborate pretense of concern for his dying brother and sister-in-law, summoning additional physicians from Florence and even requesting prayers from monasteries throughout Tuscany. His public displays of grief and anxiety served to deflect suspicion while positioning him as the natural successor to the Grand Duchy. Behind this facade of fraternal devotion, however, the cardinal was already making preparations to assume power, quietly meeting with key advisors and military commanders to ensure a smooth transition of authority. The deaths occurred within hours of each other on October 19th and 20th, 1587, that Francesco died on October 19th, 4:05 a.m., and Bianca on October 20th, 3 p.m. The interval between their deaths, approximately 11 hours, reflected the slight differences in their body weight and the amount of poisoned wine each had consumed, but both succumbed to the same systematic organ failure caused by arsenics, devastating effects on their cardiovascular and nervous system. The immediate aftermath of these deaths revealed the extent of Cardinal Ferdinando's preparation for his assumption of power. Medical records show that he ordered immediate autopsies on the two bodies. 4 terracotta jars containing the viscera were brought to Santa Maria a Buonistallo. These autopsies, while ostensibly conducted to determine the cause of death, actually served to preserve evidence that would centuries later prove Cardinal Ferdinando's guilt through advanced forensic analysis. Yet even as Cardinal Ferdinando celebrated his successful elimination of the obstacles to his ambition, questions began to circulate among the Tuscan nobility about the convenient timing and suspicious circumstances of the deaths. How had two relatively healthy individuals suddenly contracted identical fatal illnesses after dining with the very man who stood to benefit most from their demise? The news of Francesco That's death spread through Florence with the speed of wildfire, carried by mounted messengers who rode through the night to deliver word of the Grand Duke's sudden demise to government officials, foreign ambassadors, and leading citizens whose support would be crucial for maintaining stability during the inevitable succession crisis. Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, despite his ostensible grief at losing his beloved brother, moved with remarkable efficiency to consolidate his position, suggesting a level of preparation that could only have resulted from advanced knowledge of Francesco's impending death. The cardinal's immediate actions in the hours following the deaths revealed the sophisticated planning that had preceded his brother's assassination. While still maintaining his pose as a grieving relative, Ferdinando dispatched trusted agents to secure key locations throughout Florence, including the Palazzo Vecchio, the Uffizi offices where important state documents were stored, and the Fortress of Santa Barbara, which controlled access to the city's main armory. These moves, presented as necessary security measures during a period of governmental transition, actually represented the execution of a carefully developed contingency plan that had been months in the making. The speed with which Cardinal Ferdinando assumed control of the Grand Duchy surprised even experienced political observers who had expected a more prolonged period of uncertainty. Within 24 hours of Francesco's death, the cardinal had met with the Tuscan Senate, received pledges of loyalty from military commanders, and issued proclamations ensuring continuity of government services. This remarkable efficiency stood in stark contrast to the usual chaos that accompanied sudden changes in leadership, suggesting that key officials had been prepared in advance for Francesco's demise. The official explanation for the deaths, that both Francesco and Bianca had succumbed to malaria contracted during their stay at the villa, faced immediate skepticism from those familiar with the political dynamics of the Medici court. Historical accounts note that soon after the sudden and simultaneous deaths of Francesco I, rumors spread that the two had been murdered by Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando. These rumors persisted despite official denials and the lack of concrete evidence that contemporary investigative methods could uncover. The autopsy procedures conducted on Francesco and Bianca's bodies served multiple purposes beyond determining the cause of death. Forensic documentation reveals that Cardinal Ferdinando ordered immediate autopsies on the two bodies. 4 terracotta jars containing the viscera were brought to Santa Maria a Buonistallo. While these autopsies failed to identify arsenic, poisoning using 16th century medical knowledge, they inadvertently preserved tissue samples that would eventually provide conclusive proof of murder when analyzed using modern forensic techniques. The preservation of the victim's organs in terracotta jars represented standard medical practice for high-ranking individuals, serving both religious and practical purposes. The removal and separate storage of internal organs allowed for more elaborate funeral ceremonies while preventing the rapid decomposition that would have made extended viewing impossible in the October heat. However, this preservation process also created an unprecedented opportunity for future forensic investigation, essentially providing a 400-year-old crime scene that could be analyzed using techniques unknown to Renaissance physicians. Cardinal Ferdinando's transformation from ecclesiastical figure to secular ruler required careful navigation of both church law and political reality. His position as a cardinal had provided him with extensive experience in diplomatic affairs and administrative management, skills that proved invaluable in establishing his authority over the Grand Duchy. However, his ecclesiastical status also created potential complications, as church law technically prohibited cardinals from exercising temporal power over secular territories. The resolution of this canonical conflict required papal approval, which Cardinal Ferdinando secured through a combination of political maneuvering and financial incentives. Pope Sixtus V, while personally disapproving of cardinals who abandoned their spiritual responsibilities for worldly power, recognized the practical necessity of maintaining stability in Tuscany, particularly given the Grand Duchy's strategic importance in the ongoing conflicts between Catholic and Protestant powers in Northern Europe. The process of legitimizing Ferdinando's succession involved elaborate legal and ceremonial procedures designed to create an aura of inevitability around his assumption of power. The Tuscan Senate, while technically possessing the authority to choose Francesco's successor, operated under constraints that made Cardinal Ferdinando's confirmation virtually certain. His control of key military units, combined with his extensive network of political allies, created a situation where opposition to his succession would have been both futile and dangerous. The elimination of potential rivals proceeded with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the murders of Francesco and Bianca. Don Antonio, Francesco's illegitimate son whose existence posed a theoretical threat to Ferdinando's legitimacy, found himself placed under protective custody that resembled house arrest more than familial care. Other relatives with potential claims to the succession were either co-opted through generous financial settlements or quietly removed from positions of influence within the Medici administration. The international reaction to Francesco's death and Ferdinando's succession reflected the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized late 16th century European politics. The Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II, who had maintained cordial relations with Francesco despite occasional diplomatic tensions, expressed official condolences while privately reassessing the implications of Ferdinando's rise to power. The Republic of Venice, traditionally suspicious of Medici expansion, adopted a wait-and-see approach that avoided premature commitments to either support or opposition. France's response proved particularly significant given the ongoing religious wars that had devastated the kingdom for over 2 decades. King Henry III, himself struggling to maintain authority in the face of Catholic League opposition, recognized in Ferdinando's successful coup a potentially valuable example of how decisive action could overcome political obstacles. French diplomatics. Correspondence from this period reveals considerable interest in the methods by which Cardinal Ferdinando had eliminated his rivals while maintaining an appearance of legitimacy. The economic implications of the transition became apparent within weeks of Ferdinando's assumption of power. Historical records indicate that Francesco's extensive personal wealth, including valuable art collections, real estate holdings, and liquid assets, passed directly to his successor without the complications that would have accompanied a more disputed succession. This financial windfall provided Cardinal Ferdinando with resources necessary to consolidate his position through strategic bribes, military expenditures, and public works projects designed to demonstrate his effectiveness as a ruler. The investigation into the circumstances of Francesco and Bianca's deaths, while officially thorough, was conducted under the supervision of officials whose continued employment depended on Cardinal Ferdinando's favor. This fundamental conflict of interest ensured that inconvenient evidence would be overlooked while alternative explanations for the deaths received disproportionate emphasis. The official conclusion that both victims had died of malaria satisfied the immediate need for closure while avoiding awkward questions about the new Grand Duke's potential involvement in his predecessor's demise. However, the forensic evidence preserved in those terracotta jars would eventually tell a very different story. Modern analysis revealed that 3 soft tissue samples, A, B, C, excavated from 16th century autopsy jars, contained arsenic at concentrations of 27.27, 20.81, and 33.28 micromolar, levels far exceeding what could be explained by environmental contamination or natural causes. This scientific proof of arsenic poisoning, unavailable to 16th century investigators, would ultimately vindicate centuries of suspicion about Cardinal Ferdinando's role in his brother's death. The successful execution of this complex assassination plot demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of chemistry, politics, and human psychology that characterized Renaissance Italian power struggles. Yet even as Cardinal Ferdinando celebrated his triumph over the obstacles to his ambition, The preserved evidence of his crimes waited patiently in their terracotta containers, ready to bear witness against him when science had advanced sufficiently to unlock their secrets. But what drove a man of the church to commit such heinous acts? And how did the methods employed in these murders reflect the broader culture of violence that permeated Renaissance Italian politics? The year 2004 marked a turning point in one of Renaissance Italy's most enduring murder mysteries, as archaeologists working in the crypt of Santa Maria a Buonistallo made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of Francesco III de' Medici's death. The 4 terracotta jars that had rested undisturbed for over 4 centuries suddenly became the centerpiece of a forensic investigation that would employ cutting-edge scientific techniques to solve a crime that had confounded investigators for generations. What these ancient vessels contained would ultimately provide irrefutable proof that Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici had indeed poisoned his brother and sister-in-law to secure his own rise to power. The archaeological excavation that led to this breakthrough was initially intended as a routine documentation project, part of ongoing efforts to catalogue and preserve important historical artifacts throughout Tuscany. The team of researchers, led by Dr. Elisabetta Cilli from the University of Bologna's Department of Experimental Evolutionary Biology, approached the project with no expectation of uncovering evidence of murder. Their goal was simply to examine the preserved remains and potentially gather information about disease patterns and medical practices in Renaissance Italy. The condition of the terracotta jars amazed the archaeological team. Despite 4 centuries of burial, the vessels had remained largely intact, their contents preserved in a state that would prove crucial for forensic analysis. Research documentation shows that when opened, the jars yielded 3 soft tissue pieces, A, B, C, and control mold samples, D, E, plus a femur fragment, F, and beard hair, G. This remarkable preservation resulted from the specific environmental conditions within the crypt, where consistent temperature and humidity levels had prevented the complete decomposition that would normally occur over such an extended period. The initial visual examination of the tissue samples revealed little that seemed suspicious to modern eyes. The preserved organs appeared consistent with normal post-mortem changes modified by centuries of environmental exposure. However, the research team's decision to conduct comprehensive chemical analysis using advanced spectroscopic techniques would soon reveal the deadly secret that these tissues had guarded for over 400 years. The forensic analysis employed 2 primary methodological approaches: inductively coupled plasma atomic emission, spectroscopy, ICP-AES, and instrumental neutron activation analysis, INAA. These sophisticated analytical techniques, unavailable to Renaissance investigators, could detect trace amounts of toxic substances that would have been completely undetectable using 16th century methods. The results were startling. Sample A, soft tissue, male, ICP-AES 27.27 mcg. Sample B, soft tissue, female, 20.81 mcg. Sample C, soft tissue, male, 33.28 mcg. To understand the significance of these arsenic concentrations, the research team had to account for the effects of 4 centuries of dehydration and environmental exposure. Their calculations indicated that after adjusting for 4 centuries of dehydration, these correspond to 5.48.2 mkg A, 4.26.2 mkg B, and 6.610.0 mkg C in fresh tissue. These levels far exceeded the concentrations that would result from environmental contamination or the minimal arsenic exposure common in Renaissance-era daily life. The control samples collected from the surrounding soil and mold deposits provided crucial comparative data that ruled out environmental sources of arsenic contamination. Analysis showed that control soil mold samples DE had only 1.26 and 1.31 mmol/kg, demonstrating that the high arsenic levels in the tissue samples could not be explained by leaching from surrounding materials over the centuries of burial. Perhaps even more significant than the chemical analysis was the DNA profiling that confirmed the identity of the tissue samples. Using advanced genetic techniques, the research team was able to extract sufficient DNA material to establish the victims' identities with remarkable precision. The results showed that DNA profiling matched samples A and C to Francesco Ferns and identified B as female, tentatively Bianca, providing scientific confirmation that the preserved tissues indeed belonged to the historical figures whose deaths had generated centuries of speculation. The pattern of arsenic distribution within the tissue samples provided additional insights into the method and timing of the poisoning. Analysis of Francesco's remains revealed that bone, F, and beard hair, G, from Francesco showed low arsenic, 0.22 and 1.49 mg/kg, consistent with a short 11-day acute exposure. This distribution pattern indicated that the victims had received a massive dose of arsenic over a brief period rather than experiencing chronic exposure over months or years, supporting the theory that they had been poisoned during their final visit to Poggio a Caiano. The forensic evidence also revealed important details about the specific form of arsenic used in the murders. The researchers determined that the poison had been administered in an organic compound rather than simple arsenic trioxide, suggesting a level of chemical sophistication that was impressive even by Renaissance standards. This finding corroborated historical accounts of the elaborate poison preparation methods employed by noble families during this period, when skilled alchemists and physicians could create deadly substances that were virtually undetectable using contemporary analytical methods. The implications of these forensic revelations extended far beyond the specific case of Francesco and Bianca's murders. The scientific confirmation of arsenic poisoning validated centuries of historical speculation while demonstrating the potential for modern forensic techniques to solve ancient crimes. The case became a model for similar investigations of suspicious deaths throughout European history, inspiring new research projects that would apply comparable analytical methods to other historical mysteries. The revelation that Cardinal Ferdinando had indeed murdered his brother and sister-in-law also shed new light on the political dynamics of late Renaissance Italy. The forensic evidence confirmed that Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, Francesco Fern's brother, was the prime suspect, with clear motive: secure his own claim to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany by eliminating Francesco I and Bianca. This scientific vindication of historical suspicions provided insight into the ruthless calculations that drove political decision-making during this turbulent period. The preservation of the crime scene evidence for over 4 centuries represented an extraordinary stroke of forensic fortune that highlighted the importance of maintaining historical artifacts even when their immediate significance might not be apparent. The terracotta jars that had seemed like simple examples of Renaissance burial practices proved to contain some of the most important forensic evidence in Italian criminal history, demonstrating how scientific advances could unlock secrets that had remained hidden for generations. The case also illustrated the sophisticated methods employed by Renaissance poisoners who understood enough about human physiology and chemistry to create deadly substances that would remain undetected for centuries. The research revealed that the arsenic had been administered in a form and dosage calculated to produce illness onset mid-October 1587. Francesco died Oct 19th between 4 to 5 a.m. Bianca died Oct 20 at 3 p.m., suggesting that Cardinal Ferdinando and his accomplices possessed detailed knowledge of arsenic's effects on the human body. The scientific resolution of this historical mystery provided closure to one of the most enduring questions in Medici family history, while opening new avenues for understanding the role of poison in Renaissance political conflicts. The forensic evidence from those ancient jars had finally given voice to Francesco and Bianca's silent testimony, revealing the truth about their deaths and confirming the guilt of the man who had benefited most from their demise. Yet even as justice was finally served through scientific revelation, questions remained about the broader culture of violence and betrayal that had made such crimes not only possible but seemingly inevitable in the world of Renaissance Italian politics. The autumn of 1494 dawned crisp and clear over Florence, painting the city's red-tiled rooftops in golden hues that seemed to promise prosperity and intellectual achievement for the scholars who had made the Republic their home. Within the walls of the convent of San Marco, two of Renaissance Italy's most brilliant minds pursued their daily routines of study, prayer, and philosophical discourse, unaware that they were living their final weeks on earth. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, at 31 years of age the most celebrated humanist philosopher of his generation, and Angelo Poliziano, the poet-scholar whose elegant Latin verses had earned him international acclaim, represented the pinnacle of Renaissance intellectual achievement. Yet their very brilliance would soon make them targets for a murder plot that would demonstrate how dangerous knowledge could become when it threatened established political power. The convent of San Marco occupied a unique position within Florence's intellectual landscape, serving simultaneously as a religious community, a repository of classical learning, and an informal academy where the city's leading scholars gathered to exchange ideas and debate philosophical questions. The convent's library, enriched by generations of scholarly donations and careful acquisitions, contained one of the finest collections of Greek and Latin manuscripts in all of Europe. It was here that Pico and Poliziano spent countless hours poring over ancient texts, developing the revolutionary ideas that would eventually cost them their lives. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola had arrived at San Marco as a refuge from the political turmoil that had marked his entire adult life. Born into minor nobility in the small principality of Mirandola, he had demonstrated extraordinary intellectual gifts from an early age, mastering Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic before his 20th birthday. His famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, delivered in Rome when he was barely 23, had established him as the leading proponent of humanist philosophy, arguing for the unlimited potential of human knowledge and achievement. However, his radical ideas about the compatibility of Christian theology with pagan philosophy had earned him powerful enemies within the church hierarchy. The young philosopher's relationship with the Medici family was complex and politically fraught. Lorenzo the Magnificent had provided him with protection and financial support during his conflicts with papal authorities, viewing Pico's international reputation as an asset to Florence's cultural prestige. However, Lorenzo's death in 1492 had left Pico vulnerable to the changing political winds that swept through Florence as the city struggled to maintain its independence in the face of foreign invasion and internal strife. Angelo Poliziano, 10 years older than his friend and philosophical companion, brought a different but equally valuable set of skills to their scholarly partnership. Where Pico excelled in philosophical speculation and theological debate, Poliziano possessed an unmatched ability to craft elegant poetry and prose that could make even the most abstract concepts accessible to educated readers. His translations of Homer and other classical authors had helped introduce Greek literature to Italian humanist circles, while his original compositions demonstrated that contemporary writers could equal the achievements of ancient masters. Wozzeschin's friendship between these two remarkable men extended beyond mere intellectual companionship into realms of emotional intimacy that would later fuel speculation about the nature of their relationship. Historical research indicates that Poliziano may have been Pico's lover, a relationship that would have been both socially scandalous and potentially dangerous in late 15th century Florence. Whether their bond was romantic or simply the deep affection of kindred spirits, their devotion to each other would ultimately lead them to share the same fate when political forces decided that their influence had become too dangerous to tolerate. The intellectual environment at San Marco during the autumn of 1494 was charged with an excitement that reflected the broader cultural transformation occurring throughout Italy. The recent arrival of Greek scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople had brought new manuscripts and fresh perspectives on classical learning. Simultaneously, the development of printing technology was making books more widely available, accelerating the spread of humanist ideas beyond the narrow circles of wealthy patrons and university scholars. Pico and Poliziano threw themselves into this intellectual ferment with characteristic enthusiasm, spending long hours translating newly discovered texts, debating philosophical questions with visiting scholars, and developing comprehensive syntheses of Christian and pagan wisdom that they believed could revolutionize European thought. Their daily routine typically began before dawn with private prayer and meditation, followed by collaborative study sessions that often extended late into the evening. They took their meals together in the convent's refectory, discussing their latest discoveries and planned writings while sharing the simple but nutritious fare provided by the Dominican community. The political situation in Florence during this period created an atmosphere of uncertainty that affected every aspect of intellectual life. The death of Lorenzo the Magnificent had left a power vacuum that various factions struggled to fill, while the approach of French armies under Charles threatened the city's traditional independence. Into this chaos stepped Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose apocalyptic preaching and calls for moral reform had attracted a growing following among Florence's citizens. Savonarola's influence within the convent of San Marco was particularly strong, as he had been appointed prior of the community in 1491 and had used his position to implement sweeping reforms in monastic life. His vision of Florence as a new Jerusalem, purified of corruption and dedicated to divine service, appealed to many citizens who were disgusted with the political machinations and moral laxity that had characterized the final years of Medici rule. However, this same vision put him on a collision course with humanist scholars whose devotion to pagan learning seemed incompatible with Christian purification. The relationship between Pico, Poliziano, and Savonarola was complicated by genuine, mutual respect that transcended their philosophical differences. Historical accounts suggest that this drift of thought sensitized Pico to the fulminations of Girolamo Savonarola, the mad monk, and it may have contributed to his death. Pico's mystical tendencies and desire for spiritual reform made him sympathetic to some aspects of Savonarola's message, even as his commitment to classical learning put him at odds with the friar's condemnation of pagan philosophy. This intellectual and spiritual tension created a unique dynamic within the convent walls, where scholarly debate took on existential urgency as participants grappled with fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and faith, ancient wisdom and Christian revelation. The discussions that took place in the convent's library and garden were not merely academic exercises but explorations of how Europe's educated elite should respond to the profound challenges facing their civilization. The daily rhythm of life at San Marco provided numerous opportunities for observation and surveillance by those who might wish to monitor the scholars' activities and associations. Visitors to the convent included diplomats, merchants, fellow academics, and religious pilgrims whose presence created perfect cover for potential assassins or their agents. The communal dining arrangements, shared worship services, and collaborative study sessions all created situations where poison could be administered without arousing immediate suspicion. As October 1494 progressed toward its fateful conclusion, neither Pico nor Poliziano showed any awareness that their lives were in danger. They continued their scholarly work with characteristic intensity, rushing to complete projects that they apparently sensed might be their final contributions to human knowledge. Their correspondence from this period reveals no particular anxiety about political developments, though both men were certainly aware of the broader tensions affecting Florence and the Italian peninsula. The irony of their situation, that their very dedication to expanding human knowledge had made them targets for elimination, would have appealed to their philosophical sensibilities had they been aware of it. These two scholars, who had devoted their lives to understanding the complexities of human nature and divine providence, were about to become victims of the same political calculations and personal ambitions that had destroyed countless others throughout history. Yet, even as their enemies prepared to serve them their final meal, Pico and Poliziano continued their quest for truth and beauty, unaware that knowledge itself had become a capital crime in the dangerous world of Renaissance Italian politics. The winter months of 1496 brought an unexpected revelation that would cast new light on the mysterious deaths of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Angelo Poliziano 2 years earlier. In the cramped, damp cell of a Venetian prison, a man named Christopher of Casalmaggiore found himself facing torture and possible execution for crimes that seemed unrelated to the deaths of the two scholars. Yet, under the pressure of judicial interrogation, Christopher would provide testimony that finally explained how two of Renaissance Italy's greatest minds had been murdered by agents acting on behalf of the exiled Medici family. The circumstances that led to Christopher's capture and confession revealed the complex network of political intrigue that had made the scholars' deaths both possible and necessary from the perspective of their enemies. According to historical documentation, the Venetian historian Marino Sanuto recorded in his diary that Christopher from Casalmaggiore confessed that in 1494 he had hastened the death of his master by poisoning. This admission, extracted under torture, provided the first concrete evidence of how the murders had been accomplished and who had ordered them. Christopher's background exemplified the type of individual who could move freely within scholarly and ecclesiastical circles without arousing suspicion. Born in the small town of Casalmaggiore in the Po Valley, he had received sufficient education to serve as a secretary and personal assistant to educated men. Yet his humble origins meant that he remained largely invisible to those who might have been suspicious of more prominent figures. His position as a servant in scholarly households provided perfect cover for surveillance and, ultimately, assassination. The process by which Christopher had been recruited as an agent for the Medici faction demonstrated the sophisticated methods employed by Renaissance political organizations to penetrate their enemies' defenses. Rather than relying on obvious bribes or threats, Medici operatives had identified Christopher's personal vulnerabilities, including gambling debts and family obligations that created financial pressure, and gradually drawn him into their service through a combination of financial assistance and emotional manipulation. The recruitment process had begun months before the actual murders, as Medici agents carefully studied the daily routines and personal relationships of their intended targets. Christopher's employment in a household that frequently interacted with scholars at San Marco made him an invaluable source of intelligence about Pico and Poliziano's activities, associations, and potential vulnerabilities. His reports, delivered through a chain of intermediaries that protected the identity of his ultimate employers, provided detailed information about everything from the scholars' eating habits to their correspondence with foreign contacts. The decision to proceed with the assassinations reflected careful political calculation by Piero de' Medici and his advisors, who viewed the continuing influence of Pico and Poliziano as a threat to their eventual return to power in Florence. Historical analysis suggests that Pico, in Vincetti's view, was assassinated on the orders of Piero de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. The scholars' support for Savonarola's reforms and their criticism of Medici policies had made them dangerous enemies whose elimination was deemed necessary for the family's political survival. The specific method chosen for the murders, arsenic poisoning administered over several days, reflected both the assassins' technical sophistication and their understanding of how to avoid detection in an era when sudden deaths were commonly attributed to natural causes. Christopher's confession revealed that he had been provided with a carefully prepared arsenic compound that could be mixed into food or drink without significantly altering taste or appearance. Modern forensic analysis would later confirm that both contained toxic levels of arsenic when their remains were exhumed and analyzed in 2007. The administration of the poison required careful timing and multiple doses to ensure that the victims' deaths would appear to result from natural illness rather than foul play. Christopher's position within the household structure at San Marco provided him with numerous opportunities to contaminate the scholars' food and drink without arousing suspicion. The communal dining arrangements at the convent meant that many people had access to the scholars' meals, making it difficult to identify any single individual as responsible for their poisoning. The symptoms experienced by Pico and Poliziano during their final weeks were consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning, involving gradual deterioration punctuated by periods of apparent improvement that gave false hope to their friends and physicians. Historical accounts describe how he took almost 2 weeks to die and how the King of France, Charles VIII, who was marching from Pisa to Florence at the time, dispatched his own physicians to tend to the great mind of the age. They arrived too late. The timing of the murders coincided with Charles V's invasion of Italy, creating a perfect cover for political assassination, as the chaos of war provided numerous alternative explanations for sudden deaths. The French king's genuine concern for Pico's welfare, demonstrated by his dispatch of royal physicians, reflected the international reputation that made the scholar's death a significant loss to European intellectual life. However, this same international prominence had made Pico a valuable target for elimination by those who viewed his influence as politically dangerous. Christopher's confession revealed not only the mechanics of the poisoning, but also the broader network of accomplices and enablers who had made the murders possible. His testimony implicated several other servants and minor officials who had provided assistance, information, or simple silence in exchange for payment or protection. This web of complicity demonstrated how even the most secure environments could be penetrated by determined adversaries with sufficient resources and planning. The psychological toll of participating in the murders was evident in Christopher's behavior during the 2 years between the crimes and his eventual capture. Fellow prisoners and guards noted his frequent nightmares, excessive drinking, and obsessive references to the great men whose deaths he had caused. This deterioration in his mental state may have contributed to the circumstances that led to his arrest, as his increasingly erratic behavior drew unwanted attention from law enforcement officials. The confession process itself reflected the brutal realities of Renaissance criminal justice, where torture was routinely employed to extract information from suspected criminals. Christopher's willingness to provide detailed testimony about the murders may have been motivated as much by his desire to end his physical suffering as by any genuine remorse for his crimes. However, the specific details he provided about the poisoning methods and the identity of his employers proved remarkably accurate when later verified through historical research and forensic analysis. The revelation that Pico and Poliziano had been murdered sent shockwaves through European intellectual circles, where both men had been revered as exemplars of humanist learning and moral integrity. Their deaths had initially been attributed to natural causes, possibly plague or other epidemic diseases that were common in Renaissance Italy, But Christopher's confession forced a re-evaluation of these assumptions and raised troubling questions about the safety of scholars who challenged established political authority. The broader implications of the murders extended beyond the immediate tragedy of two brilliant lives cut short. The systematic elimination of intellectual dissidents represented a fundamental threat to the humanist project of expanding human knowledge and challenging traditional assumptions about politics, religion, and society. If scholars could be murdered for their ideas, what hope remained for the advancement of learning and the pursuit of truth? Yet even as the shocking details of Christopher's confession circulated among Europe's intellectual elite, questions remained about the full extent of the conspiracy that had claimed Pico and Poliziano's lives, and whether other scholars might be at risk from similar plots. The revelations contained in Christopher of Castelmaggiore's confession transformed the deaths of Giovanni Pico, della Mirandola, and Angelo Poliziano from tragic, natural occurrences into deliberate martyrdoms that exemplified the dangerous intersection of intellectual achievement and political power in Renaissance Italy. The systematic nature of their assassination, carefully planned and executed over months of preparation, demonstrated that their murders were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader campaign to eliminate scholars whose ideas threatened established authority. As news of the confession spread through European intellectual circles during the late 1490s, it became clear that the pursuit of knowledge itself had become a potentially fatal enterprise. The impact of these revelations on the scholarly community was profound and lasting. Universities throughout Europe instituted new security measures to protect their faculty and students, while individual scholars began to exercise greater caution in their choice of patrons and associates. The atmosphere of free intellectual exchange that had characterized early Renaissance humanism gave way to a more guarded approach, as scholars recognized that their pursuit of truth could make them targets for political assassination. The methods employed in the murders, particularly the use of arsenic administered over an extended period, revealed a level of sophistication that suggested the involvement of individuals with considerable expertise in chemistry and medicine. Modern forensic analysis confirmed that forensic tests determined that both had died from arsenic, likely at the command of Lorenzo's successor, Piero de' Medici. This scientific validation of centuries-old suspicions provided definitive proof that the scholars had indeed been murdered, vindicating those who had questioned the official explanations for their deaths. The specific choice of arsenic as the murder weapon reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. From a practical standpoint, arsenic poisoning could be easily disguised as natural illness, particularly in an era when diagnostic capabilities were limited and sudden deaths from various diseases were common. The slow-acting nature of arsenic also allowed the assassins to establish alibis by ensuring that the victims' deaths occurred days or weeks after the poison had been administered. Symbolically, the use of poison represented a particularly insidious form of murder that violated the basic trust required for civilized social interaction. In a scholarly community where meals were routinely shared as part of intellectual discourse, the contamination of food and drink transformed the very act of hospitality into a weapon of destruction. This violation of social norms added an extra dimension of horror to the crimes, making them not just murders, but betrayals of the fundamental principles that governed scholarly society. The investigation that eventually led to Christopher's confession demonstrated both the persistence of those seeking justice and the limitations of Renaissance-era criminal investigation techniques. Historical documentation shows that the case remained unsolved for 2 years before Christopher's capture for unrelated crimes provided the opportunity for authorities to extract his confession through torture. This delay reflected the sophisticated nature of the murder plot and the skill with which the conspirators had covered their tracks. The political circumstances surrounding the murders reflected the broader instability that characterized Italian politics during the late 15th century. The death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492 had created a power vacuum in Florence that various factions struggled to fill, while foreign invasions threatened the independence of Italian city-states. In this chaotic environment, intellectual figures like Pico and Poliziano found themselves caught between competing political forces, their scholarly reputations making them valuable allies or dangerous enemies depending on one's perspective. The relationship between the scholars and Girolamo Savonarola added another layer of complexity to their political situation. Historical analysis suggests that Pico's drift of thought sensitized him to the fulminations of Girolamo Savonarola, the mad monk, and it may have contributed to his death. Savonarola's calls for moral reform and his criticism of Medici rule had attracted support from various quarters, including some humanist scholars who saw his movement as an opportunity to create a more just and virtuous society. However, this association with Savonarola made Pico and Poliziano suspect in the eyes of Medici supporters who viewed the friars' reforms as a threat to their family's eventual return to power. The scholars' intellectual influence made them particularly dangerous, as their support for Savonarola's cause could help legitimize his movement among educated elites throughout Italy. From Piero de' Medici's perspective, eliminating these influential supporters represented a necessary step in undermining Savonarola's political position. The execution of the murder plot required careful coordination among multiple participants, each playing a specific role in the complex operation. Christopher's confession revealed the existence of a network that included not only the actual poisoner, but also suppliers of the toxic substances, intermediaries who transmitted orders, and payments and observers who monitored the victims' activities and reported on their condition. This level of organization suggested that the Medici faction possessed considerable resources and expertise in conducting clandestine operations. The preservation of evidence from the crime scene proved crucial for modern forensic investigators, who were able to confirm the presence of arsenic in the victims' remains over 5 centuries after their deaths. Scientific analysis revealed that when his remains, together with those of the man who may have been his lover, the scholar-poet Angelo Poliziano, were disinterred from the Dominican convent of San Marco in Florence, both contained toxic levels of arsenic. This remarkable preservation of forensic evidence demonstrated how modern scientific techniques could solve historical mysteries that had confounded investigators for centuries. The DNA analysis conducted on the exhumed remains provided additional confirmation of the victims' identities while also revealing intimate details about their relationship. The scientific evidence supporting the theory that Pico and Poliziano were lovers added a personal dimension to their tragedy, suggesting that their emotional bond may have made them even more vulnerable to their enemies' machinations. In a society where homosexual relationships were both illegal and socially condemned, their personal connection could have provided additional leverage for those seeking to destroy them. The broader cultural impact of the murders extended far beyond their immediate political consequences. The systematic elimination of leading humanist scholars sent a chilling message to Europe's intellectual community about the dangers of challenging established authority. Universities and scholarly societies began to exercise greater caution in their choice of research topics and political associations, while individual scholars became more circumspect in their public statements and private correspondence. Martyrdom of Pico and Poliziano also contributed to the growing tension between humanist learning and religious orthodoxy that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Their deaths demonstrated that even the most brilliant and well-intentioned scholars could become victims of political violence when their ideas threatened powerful interests. This realization helped fuel the development of new approaches to scholarship that emphasized careful documentation, peer review, and institutional protection for researchers. The long-term consequences of the murders continued to influence Italian politics and culture for decades after the scholars' deaths. Savonarola's eventual execution in 1498 eliminated the immediate political threat that had motivated the assassinations, but the memory of Pico and Poliziano's martyrdom inspired subsequent generations of scholars and reformers who viewed them as symbols of intellectual courage in the face of political oppression. The modern forensic investigation that finally confirmed the murders after more than 5 centuries demonstrated both the persistence of historical memory and the power of scientific advancement to reveal long-hidden truths. The research team's work involved scientists from the University of Bologna, the University of Pisa, and the University of Lecce, who applied cutting-edge analytical techniques to solve one of Renaissance Italy's most enduring mysteries. The vindication of centuries-old suspicions about the scholars' deaths provided closure for those who had long believed that Pico and Poliziano had been murdered for their ideas. More importantly, it demonstrated that even the most sophisticated cover-ups could ultimately be exposed through patient investigation and advancing scientific capabilities. The forensic evidence from those ancient graves finally allowed the victims to testify against their murderers, providing justice delayed but not denied. The story of these scholar martyrs serves as a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge has never been a safe or purely academic enterprise. Throughout history, those who challenge established assumptions and seek to expand human understanding have faced persecution, exile, and death at the hands of those who benefit from ignorance and superstition. The murders of Pico and Poliziano exemplified this eternal conflict between knowledge and power, demonstrating that even the most brilliant minds were vulnerable when their ideas threatened those in authority. Yet their deaths also testified to the enduring power of human curiosity and the willingness of scholars to pursue truth regardless of personal danger. In choosing to support Savonarola's reforms and continue their scholarly work, despite growing political tensions, Pico and Poliziano demonstrated the courage that has always characterized the greatest intellectual pioneers. Their martyrdom ensured that their ideas would live on, inspiring future generations of scholars who would carry forward their commitment to expanding human knowledge and challenging unjust authority. In the narrow, winding streets of 17th-century Palermo, where the Mediterranean sun cast long shadows between towering buildings of honey-colored stone, a most peculiar form of commerce flourished in plain sight of both civil and ecclesiastical authorities. Small glass vials bearing the image of St. Nicholas of Bari were sold openly in markets and shops throughout the city, their contents marketed as a beneficial cosmetic preparation for improving complexion and enhancing feminine beauty. Yet these innocuous-looking bottles contained something far more deadly than their religious imagery suggested. They held aqua tofana, the most sophisticated, slow-acting poison ever devised, a chemical weapon that would ultimately claim over 600 lives while providing desperate women with what they considered their only escape from brutal marriages and impossible domestic situations. The creation of aqua tofana around 1630 represented the culmination of centuries of Italian expertise in the preparation of subtle poisons, combining advanced chemical knowledge with an intimate understanding of social dynamics that made detection virtually impossible. According to historical documentation, aqua tofana, also known as aqua tofana and aqua tufania, and manna di San Nicola, was a strong arsenic-based poison created in Sicily around 1630 that was reputedly widely used in Palermo, Naples, Perugia, and Rome, Italy, during the Renaissance. The poison's multiple names reflected both its wide geographic distribution and the various cover stories employed to disguise its true purpose. The genius of aqua tofana lay not only in its chemical composition, but in its marketing strategy. which exploited the deep religious devotion of Italian women while providing perfect camouflage for a deadly substance. The poison was camouflaged in bottles labeled Manna di San Nicola, Manna of St. Nicholas of Bari, a marketing device intended to divert the authorities, giving the poison an appearance of cosmetic and a devotional object in vials that included a picture of St. Nicholas. This religious disguise made the poison virtually invisible to law enforcement officials, who would never suspect that bottles bearing sacred imagery could contain anything harmful. The specific choice of St. Nicholas as the poison's patron reflected sophisticated understanding of popular religious culture in southern Italy. St. Nicholas of Bari was particularly venerated by women who prayed to him for protection from domestic violence and assistance in family crises. The irony of using his image to market a poison designed to eliminate abusive husbands would not have been lost on the women who purchased these deadly vials, creating a form of dark humor that helped them psychologically cope with their desperate circumstances. The chemical composition of aqua tofana represented a masterpiece of medieval toxicology that combined multiple deadly substances in proportions, designed to maximize lethality while minimizing detectability. Research indicates that the active ingredients of the mixture are known, but not how they were blended. Aqua tofana contained mostly arsenic and lead, and possibly belladonna. This combination created a synergistic effect that was far more deadly than any single component would have been alone. The inclusion of belladonna in the mixture served multiple purposes beyond simple toxicity. Historical accounts note that belladonna is a flower which was commonly used in cosmetics at the time to enlarge pupils. It was a colorless, tasteless liquid and therefore easily mixed with water or wine to be served during meals. The belladonna's legitimate use in cosmetics provided additional cover for the poison's presence in households, while its psychoactive properties could induce confusion and hallucinations that would mask the early symptoms of arsenic poisoning. The preparation process for aqua tofana required considerable skill and specialized knowledge that was passed down through networks of women who had developed expertise in herbal medicine and chemical preparation. The exact methods used to create the poison were closely guarded secrets, known only to a small circle of practitioners who understood both the technical requirements and the extreme dangers involved in handling such concentrated toxic substances. The process likely involved multiple distillation and purification steps designed to remove any traces of color, odor, or taste that might alert potential victims to the poison's presence. The distribution network for aqua tofana demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its organization and security measures. Rather than relying on obvious criminal channels, the poison was distributed through networks of women who appeared to be engaged in legitimate religious and social activities. Religious confraternities, charitable organizations, and informal networks of friends and neighbors all served as vehicles for transmitting information about the poison's availability and instructions for its use. The target market for aqua tofana consisted primarily of women trapped in abusive marriages with no legal recourse for their suffering. In 17th century Italy, divorce was virtually impossible to obtain, and women had few legal rights to protect themselves from violent or exploitative husbands. Wife-beating was widely tolerated by both civil and religious authorities who viewed it as a husband's legitimate prerogative in managing his household. Under these circumstances, poison offered what many women saw as their only means of achieving freedom from intolerable domestic situations. The method of administration that made aqua tofana so effective was its remarkable ability to be mixed into food and beverages without detection. Historical documentation shows that the poison was a colorless, tasteless liquid and therefore easily mixed with water or wine to be served during meals. Its tasteless properties signify that it was made with a deliberate attempt to hide the potent metallic taste of arsenic. This careful attention to palatability reflected deep understanding of how domestic poisoning needed to be conducted to avoid suspicion. The slow-acting nature of aqua tofana was perhaps its most diabolical characteristic, as it allowed poisoners to establish perfect alibis while ensuring that their victims suffered prolonged agony before death. The poison is slow-acting, with symptoms resembling progressive disease or other natural causes, similar to the effects of arsenic poisoning. This gradual deterioration meant that victims' deaths would appear to result from natural illness rather than foul play, protecting the perpetrators from suspicion while ensuring that the poison's reputation remained intact. The symptoms experienced by aqua tofana's victims were carefully designed to mimic common diseases that were poorly understood by 17th century physicians. The initial stages of poisoning produced fatigue, digestive problems, and general malaise that could easily be attributed to various illnesses. As the poison accumulated in the victim's system, these symptoms would gradually worsen, leading to organ failure and death over a period of weeks or months. The social impact of aqua tofana extended far beyond its immediate victims to affect the entire fabric of Italian family life. As knowledge of the poison's existence spread, it created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that poisoned relationships between husbands and wives throughout the region. Men became increasingly wary of their wives' behavior, while women found themselves subject to greater surveillance and control as their husbands sought to protect themselves from potential poisoning attempts. The economic implications of the aqua tofana trade were also significant, as the poison's manufacture and distribution created a substantial underground economy that provided income for numerous individuals involved in its production and sale. The relatively high price commanded by the poison, reflecting both its effectiveness and the considerable risks involved in its manufacture, made it a lucrative business for those willing to accept the dangers involved in producing and distributing such a deadly substance. The geographical spread of aqua tofana from its origins in Sicily to major cities throughout Italy demonstrated the effectiveness of the distribution networks that had been established to market the poison. Historical records indicate that it was widely used in Palermo, Naples, Perugia, and Rome, suggesting that the poison's reputation had spread throughout the Italian peninsula, and that demand for it existed wherever women found themselves trapped in desperate domestic situations. Yet, even as aqua tofana provided what seemed like a perfect solution to the problems faced by abused women, its very success would eventually lead to the downfall of those who manufactured and distributed it. The accumulating toll of mysterious deaths would eventually attract the attention of authorities who possessed the power and determination to uncover the truth behind the epidemic of sudden male mortality that was sweeping through Italian cities. But who was responsible for creating this deadly innovation? And how did a poison disguised as holy water become the preferred weapon of women seeking freedom from domestic tyranny? The name Giulia Tofana became synonymous with both liberation and murder in the minds of 17th century Italians, as this remarkable woman transformed from an obscure Sicilian immigrant into the mastermind of the most extensive poisoning network in European history. Her operation, which moved from Palermo to Rome with practiced efficiency, represented far more than simple criminal enterprise. It constituted a sophisticated business organization that provided desperate women with both the means to eliminate abusive husbands and the psychological support necessary to carry out such drastic actions. Through careful cultivation of customer relationships, strategic partnerships with accomplices, and meticulous attention to operational security, Giulia Tofana created an empire built on death that would ultimately claim over 600 lives. The origins of Giulia Tofana's involvement in the poison trade remain shrouded in historical uncertainty, though evidence suggests that she inherited both the formula for aqua tofana and the networks necessary for its distribution from her predecessor, Teofania di Adamo. Historical records indicate that the first recorded mention of aqua tofana is from 1632 to 33, when it was used by two women, Francesca Lasada and Teofania di Adamo, to poison their victims. Teofania's execution for her crimes created a vacancy in the poison market that Julia was uniquely qualified to fill, possessing both the chemical knowledge and entrepreneurial skills necessary to expand the operation beyond its original scope. Julia's expansion of the poison business from Sicily to Rome represented a strategic masterstroke that multiplied both the market opportunities and the operational challenges facing her organization. Rome's status as the center of Catholic Christianity created unique cover opportunities for an operation disguised as religious artifact distribution, while the city's large population of wealthy merchants and nobility provided an extensive customer base of women who could afford the poison's relatively high cost. However, the move also brought increased scrutiny from papal authorities who possessed both the motivation and resources to investigate suspicious patterns of male mortality. The organizational structure that Julia developed for her Rome operation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both criminal tradecraft and legitimate business practices. Research shows that she was purportedly the leader of a ring of 6 poisoners in Rome who sold aqua tofana to Italian women who wanted to kill their husbands. This small but highly efficient organization allowed for careful quality control, while maintaining the personal relationships with customers that were essential for both marketing and operational security. Each member of Julia's organization played a specific role in the complex process of poison production, distribution, and customer support. The manufacturing process required individuals with specialized knowledge of chemistry and distillation techniques, while distribution demanded people who could move freely through Roman society without arousing suspicion. Customer relations, perhaps the most delicate aspect of the operation, required women who possessed both the psychological insight to identify potential clients and the discretion to provide guidance without creating security risks. The customer profile for aqua tofana revealed the desperate circumstances that drove respectable women to contemplate murder as their only escape from intolerable domestic situations. The poison's relatively high cost meant that its primary market consisted of middle-class and wealthy women who possessed both the financial resources to purchase it and the domestic arrangements that would allow them to administer it effectively. These women typically faced situations where legal remedies were either unavailable or inadequate to address their problems, making poisoning seem like their only viable option. The process of customer recruitment and screening represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Julia's operation. Rather than advertising openly or relying on random contacts, the organization developed elaborate procedures for identifying women who might be interested in their services while ensuring that potential customers were genuine rather than law enforcement agents or informants. This screening process typically involved multiple contacts over extended periods, allowing the organization to assess both the customer's desperation and her reliability before revealing the true nature of the services being offered. The psychological support provided to customers represented an often overlooked aspect of the aqua tofana trade that was crucial to its success. Many women who contemplated poisoning their husbands struggled with profound moral conflicts, torn between their desperate need for escape and their religious convictions about the sanctity of marriage and human life. Julia's organization provided these women with sophisticated rationalization frameworks that helped them justify their actions while maintaining their sense of moral integrity. The administration training provided to customers demonstrated the organization's commitment to ensuring successful outcomes while minimizing risks of detection. New clients received detailed instructions on dosage calculations, timing of administration, and recognition of symptoms that might indicate the need to adjust the the poisoning schedule. This training also included guidance on maintaining normal behavior patterns to avoid arousing suspicion, as well as strategies for managing the psychological stress that inevitably accompanied the slow process of watching a husband die from poison. The quality control measures implemented by Julia's organization reflected both professional pride and practical necessity, as product failures could result in exposure of the entire network. Each batch of Aqua Tofana was carefully tested to ensure proper potency and tastelessness, while the packaging process maintained strict standards for appearance and religious authenticity. The organization also maintained feedback systems that allowed them to monitor the effectiveness of their product and adjust formulations based on customer reports. The financial aspects of the Aqua Tofana trade generated substantial revenues that supported not only the immediate participants but also the broader network of suppliers and enablers who made the operation possible. The poison commanded premium prices that reflected both its effectiveness and the considerable risks involved in its manufacture and distribution. These high margins provided the organization with resources necessary to maintain operational security, compensate participants adequately, and invest in expansion of their customer base. The geographical expansion of Julia's operation beyond Rome demonstrated both the success of her business model and the growing demand for her services throughout Italy. Historical documentation indicates that Aqua Tofana was widely used in Palermo, Naples, Perugia, and Rome, suggesting that the organization had established distribution networks in multiple major cities. This expansion required sophisticated logistics and communication systems that could coordinate activities across hundreds of miles while maintaining operational security. The relationship between Julia's organization and legitimate religious institutions created both opportunities and vulnerabilities that shaped the operation's development. The use of religious imagery and terminology provided excellent cover for poison distribution activities, while genuine religious sentiment among both customers and participants created psychological barriers that helped maintain operational security. However, this religious connection also created potential exposure points if ecclesiastical authorities became suspicious of unusual patterns in religious artifact sales. The law enforcement challenges posed by Julia's operation reflected both the sophistication of her methods and the limitations of 17th-century investigative capabilities. The slow-acting nature of Aqua Tofana made it extremely difficult to establish causal connections between specific poisoning incidents and particular individuals, while the religious disguise made it nearly impossible for authorities to identify suspicious activities without conducting elaborate surveillance operations that exceeded their resources and capabilities. The social impact of Julia's enterprise extended far beyond its immediate victims to influence broader patterns of gender relations throughout Italian society. As knowledge of Aqua Tofana's existence spread, it created new dynamics of power and fear within marriages, as husbands became increasingly aware that their wives possessed access to means of eliminating them if domestic situations became intolerable. This awareness led to both positive changes in some households, as abusive men moderated their behavior, and negative consequences in others, as suspicious husbands became even more controlling and violent. The cultural legacy of Julia Tofana's operation would persist long after her death, inspiring both admiration and horror among subsequent generations who struggled to understand how a single woman had managed to create such an extensive network of death. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated commerce in deadly substances, while simultaneously serving as a symbol of female empowerment for women who saw her as someone who had successfully challenged male dominance through superior intelligence and organizational skills. Yet even as Julia's operation reached the height of its success, the very scale of her achievements was generating the attention that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The accumulating toll of mysterious deaths throughout Rome was beginning to create patterns that would eventually come to the attention of authorities, with both the power and determination to uncover the truth behind the epidemic of sudden male mortality that was transforming the demographic landscape of Italian cities. The year 1659 marked the beginning of the end for Giulia Tofana's poisoning empire, as the accumulated weight of over 600 mysterious deaths finally overwhelmed the careful security measures that had protected her organization for nearly 3 decades. The unraveling began not through brilliant detective work or sophisticated investigation, but through the simple human frailty of one terrified customer who confessed her crimes to a priest, setting in motion a chain of revelations that would expose the entire network and lead to public executions that shocked all of Europe. The case that finally broke open the Acqua Tofana conspiracy involved a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose moment of conscience would doom dozens of others. According to contemporary accounts, this unnamed woman had administered the first dose of poison to her husband when, overcome by guilt and terror, she sought spiritual counsel from her parish priest. The priest, initially bound by the seal of confession, found himself in an unprecedented moral dilemma when the woman revealed not only her own crime, but the existence of an extensive network of other women engaged in similar activities. The ecclesiastical authorities' handling of the confession revealed the complex intersection of religious duty, civil law, and practical politics that characterized Counter-Reformation Italy. While the traditional seal of confession prevented priests from directly reporting criminal activities revealed in the sacrament, church officials developed elaborate workarounds that allowed them to alert civil authorities to the existence of serious crimes without technically violating religious confidentiality. In this case, the priest's superiors authorized him to encourage the woman to make a formal confession to civil authorities, while simultaneously alerting papal investigators to the existence of a potential poisoning conspiracy. The investigation that followed demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of 17th-century law enforcement capabilities. Papal authorities possessed considerable resources and legal powers that allowed them to conduct thorough investigations, including the authority to arrest suspects, search premises, and employ torture to extract confessions. However, their investigative techniques remained primitive by modern standards, relying primarily on witness testimony and confessions rather than physical evidence or scientific analysis. The breakthrough in the investigation came when authorities arrested Geronima Spana, one of Giulia's key associates, whose capture provided investigators with their first detailed insight into the organization's structure and methods. Historical records indicate that Spana had been associated with her, including Giulia Tofana, who may have been her daughter, and had played a crucial role in manufacturing and distributing the poison throughout Rome. Under torture, Spana revealed not only the identities of other organization members, but also detailed information about customers, suppliers, and operational procedures. The interrogation of Spana and other captured associates revealed the remarkable scope of Giulia's operation, which had penetrated all levels of Roman society from servants and shopkeepers to nobility and clergy. The customer lists recovered during these investigations read like a who's who of Roman society, including women whose husbands held prominent positions in government, commerce, and the church. This revelation created a massive scandal that threatened to undermine confidence in the basic institutions of papal authority. The investigation also uncovered the sophisticated support network that had made the poisoning operation possible, including suppliers who provided raw materials, craftsmen who manufactured the distinctive bottles, and distributors who transported the finished product to customers throughout Italy. Many of these individuals claimed ignorance of the poison's true purpose, asserting that they believed they were participating in legitimate cosmetics manufacturing or religious artifact distribution. However, the investigators' discovery of Detailed records maintained by the organization suggested that most participants were fully aware of their involvement in criminal activities. The arrest of customers proved particularly challenging for authorities, as many of the women involved came from powerful families whose political connections complicated prosecution efforts. Some wealthy customers managed to escape punishment through strategic bribes or political intervention, while others fled Rome entirely to avoid arrest. However, the investigation's momentum made it impossible to protect all of the organization's clients, and numerous women from prominent families found themselves facing charges of murder. Giulia Tofana herself proved remarkably elusive during the initial stages of the investigation, demonstrating the sophisticated escape procedures that she had developed to protect herself from exactly this type of law enforcement action. Historical accounts suggest that Giulia Tofana died without being discovered, indicating that she managed to evade capture despite the extensive manhunt that followed the exposure of her organization. Her ability to disappear completely while many of her associates were captured and executed testified to both her intelligence and her careful preparation for such contingencies. The public trials and executions that followed the investigation created a sensation throughout Europe as news of the poisoning conspiracies spread beyond Italy to courts and capitals across the continent. The final accounting showed that in 1659, 5 of the women involved in the Acqua Tofana business were publicly hanged, while 40 of their clients were imprisoned for life. These harsh sentences reflected both the seriousness with which authorities viewed the crimes and their determination to deter similar activities in the future. The public executions were conducted with elaborate ceremony designed to maximize their deterrent effect while providing a form of entertainment for the masses. The condemned women were transported through the streets of Rome on carts decorated with symbols of their crimes, including bottles of Acqua Tofana and images representing their victims. Large crowds gathered to witness the hangings, which were accompanied by sermons denouncing the evils of domestic poisoning and praising the wisdom of divine justice. The broader social implications of the Acqua Tofana revelations extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect gender relations throughout Italian society. The discovery that hundreds of women had been systematically poisoning their husbands created a crisis of confidence in domestic relationships that would persist for generations. Men became increasingly suspicious of their wives' behavior, while women found themselves subject to greater surveillance and control as their husbands sought to protect themselves from potential poisoning attempts. The legal and regulatory changes that followed the Acqua Tofana scandal included new restrictions on the sale of potentially dangerous substances, enhanced penalties for domestic poisoning, and improved coordination between civil and ecclesiastical authorities in investigating suspicious deaths. These measures, while well-intentioned, proved largely ineffective in preventing similar crimes, as determined poisoners simply adapted their methods to circumvent the new restrictions. The cultural legacy of the Acqua Tofana affair persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed, inspiring numerous literary works, historical studies, and popular legends that kept the story alive in European consciousness. The figure of Giulia Tofana became a complex symbol that represented both female empowerment and criminal depravity, depending on one's perspective on gender relations and social justice. Some viewed her as a folk hero who had provided desperate women with their only means of escape from intolerable situations, while others saw her as a diabolical criminal who had corrupted the sacred bonds of marriage through her deadly commerce. The international ramifications of the Acqua Tofana scandal also influenced diplomatic relations between Italian states and other European powers, as foreign courts became concerned about the potential for similar poisoning conspiracies within their own territories. Historical documentation shows that similar poisoning cases occurred elsewhere in Europe, including Between 1666 and 1676, the Marchioness de Brinvilliers poisoned her father and two brothers, amongst others, and she was executed on July 16, 1676. These international connections suggested that the knowledge and methods developed by Giulia's organization had spread beyond Italy's borders. The scientific and medical impact of the Acqua Tofana revelations included increased interest in toxicology and poison detection methods among physicians and natural philosophers throughout Europe. The systematic nature of the poisoning conspiracy provided researchers with unprecedented data about the effects of chronic arsenic exposure, while the investigation's findings contributed to improved understanding of how such substances could be detected in suspected victims. The modern rediscovery of interest in the Acqua Tofana story reflects contemporary concerns about domestic violence and women's rights that echo the same social problems that originally drove demand for Giulia's deadly services. Recent references show that the name resurfaces in feminist social media campaigns as activists use historical examples of women's resistance to illustrate ongoing struggles for gender equality and protection from domestic abuse. The ultimate significance of the Acqua Tofana conspiracy lies not only in its scale and sophistication, but in its revelation of the desperate circumstances that could drive otherwise respectable women to commit murder. The story serves as a dark mirror reflecting the limitations of legal and social systems that failed to protect vulnerable individuals from domestic violence and exploitation. While few would endorse Giulia Tofana's methods, her success in building an organization that provided women with alternatives to helpless victimization continues to fascinate and disturb those who encounter her remarkable story. The legacy of Acqua Tofana thus remains deeply ambiguous, representing simultaneously a triumph of female entrepreneurship and a catastrophic failure of social institutions. The poison that disguised itself as holy water ultimately revealed the unholy realities of domestic life in 17th century Italy, while the women who distributed it demonstrated both the depths of human desperation and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go when seeking freedom from intolerable circumstances. As we reach the end of these tales of poisoned cups and deadly dining, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, trust, and survival in Renaissance Italy. The four stories we have explored, the Borgia Cantarella, chronicles the Medici murder mystery, the scholar's assassination, and the Acqua Tofana conspiracy, reveal a world where the simple act of sharing a drink had become fraught with mortal danger, where hospitality itself could be transformed into a weapon of murder. The bedtime drinks that killed nobles in Renaissance Italy were more than mere instruments of assassination. They were symbols of a society where traditional bonds of family, friendship, and social obligation had been systematically corrupted by political ambition and personal desperation. Whether served in papal goblets, ducal chalices, monastic cups, or humble household vessels, these poisoned beverages represented the ultimate violation of human trust, the transformation of sustenance into destruction, of communion into murder. The technological sophistication revealed in these poisoning cases demonstrates that Renaissance Italy possessed a level of chemical knowledge that could produce substances like Cantarella and Acqua Tofana with precision that rivaled modern pharmaceutical manufacturing. The careful attention to palatability, dosage calculation, and symptom management reflected deep understanding of both chemistry and human physiology that belied the popular image of medieval ignorance and superstition. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that these were not isolated incidents but part of systematic campaigns that claimed hundreds of lives over decades of careful planning and execution. The forensic evidence that finally confirmed these historical suspicions provides a sobering reminder that the pursuit of power and the desperation of the powerless can drive human beings to extraordinary depths of calculated cruelty. The preservation of evidence in terracotta jars and ancient graves that allowed modern science to solve these centuries-old mysteries offers hope that no crime, however carefully concealed, can remain hidden forever. Truth has its own inexorable momentum, and the voices of victims can still speak across the centuries when science provides them with the means to bear witness against their murderers. These stories of Renaissance Italian poisoning ultimately remind us that the price of knowledge, power, and freedom has always been paid in human suffering, and that the choice between justice and survival continues to haunt us, just as it haunted those who chose poison as their solution to life's most desperate problems. In the end, the bedtime drinks that killed nobles in Renaissance Italy serve as a dark lullaby about the eternal human capacity for both brilliance and evil, creativity and destruction, all mixed together in proportions that would challenge even the most skilled Renaissance poisoner to calculate.